Hi, I'm Elizabeth Duran, and today we'll be looking at Sarojini Naidu's poetry. While reading her, I have been stuck on the two questions Dr. Ziegler presented in lecture. Does Naidu reconstruct the imperialist gaze? Does she appropriate decadence for her own purposes? While these questions could be argued either way, To the God of Pain, page 216 of our Penguin edition, offers more insight and challenges the notion of Orientalism that is at play both in her work and in the Victorians' understanding of her work. At first, this poem was difficult to read. This is not due to an inaccessible meaning, it's because I couldn't localize it. I didn't know whether she was trying to be ancient or Victorian, Eastern or Western. After failing to identify a singular god or goddess that was being addressed and therefore blamed, I decided to accept the ambiguity of place and time, instead focusing on the passionate lament. From that tiny shift, the poem became more accessible and all the more poignant. The first thing that changes with this reading is actually responsibility. The first stanza certainly identifies a god and employs words like held, bound, born, which paint a picture of servitude and bondage. However, there is an element of ownership when the speaker says, bound to thy worship by reluctant vows, in line 3, and long have I borne thy service, in line 6. The very words that would imply blame and are then transformed to represent the speaker's responsibility for making vows, reluctant or not. Therefore, everything that follows is a consequence of the vow. Once the poem is seen in this light, Naidu's appropriation of decadence becomes more clear. She gives us decadence without the romance. She speaks from rock bottom and unblinkingly presents the aftermath of a passionate, decadent life. On this note, the next two stanzas richly describe what it feels like to have given all to the God of Pain. Lines 12 to 13 are especially poignant and perfectly encapsulate the air of decadence. From the sad life which has been pressed and crushed, a sweet oil has been drawn. This oil is perfumed by the flower-like dreams and gem-like fire a la Pater. It is almost as though Naidu describes the responsibility of being a decadent poet in line 17, to wring the soul, expunging its essence and leaving behind that beauty in the world. Another detail that catches my attention and further contributes to the decadent reading is the fact that the speaker addresses the God of Pain with thy and thou. This is actually an informal conjugation of your and you. By employing the informal address to the God of Pain, Naidu accomplishes many things. In a way, it reduces the power over the speaker by making the god familiar. This actually enhances the ownership over the speaker's actions, and therefore all of the pain that he or she has gone through in life. The use of thy and thou also alters the perception of time. This archaic language, in addition to fane and orisons, which mean temple and prayers, make the poem reminiscent of the ancient East, but it could just as easily be referring to the ancient Greek tradition. I tried reading the poem as though the author was anonymous, and the stigma of Orientalism was actually removed. Furthermore, the mention of gem-like fire in line 13 is the only anchor to the Victorian world besides the style. If ancient to Victorian and Eastern to Western were two axes on a plane, this poem would actually rest right in the middle. Her words dance between these quadrants in a clever manipulation of both perception and language. Reflecting on the questions that sparked my curiosity, I would say that Naidu's expression of decadence is as equally passionate as other decadent writers, but does not try to disguise the burden of burning with a hard gem-like flame that was ultimately die. I would also say that Naidu is not reconstructing the imperialist gaze. While other poems may seem to inculcate this, I would argue that Naidu is carefully manipulating said gaze in order to compare or contrast it with that of India or the so-called East. There is a notable absence of weight towards one or the other. This highlights the commonality of the ancient traditions between both sides of the world.